We've got one of the last of the Super Duties on Muscle Car of the Week. Many people believe that the muscle car peaked around 1970. This was the year we saw the highest compression ratios, we saw the highest horsepower outputs of big V8s, some of the biggest displacement engines, some of the fastest quarter-mile times. And by 1974, the muscle car was definitely in decline. Things like increased insurance premiums to insure these cars, the onset of emissions control equipment kind of choked down the power numbers, and these things needed to start making fuel economy, so the compression ratio was reduced. And what you ended up with was a lot of cars in the mid-70s that still looked like pretty cool muscle cars, but lacked the high-performance engines or the performance of their earlier brethren. But not Pontiac. Pontiac didn't give up on the 1974 Trans Am, and especially with the Super Duty option. Now, the Super Duty was a name that Pontiac had been using since the early 60s when they made factory-produced race cars, and that went all through the 60s. But by the time we got to the early 1970s, 73 and 74 in particular, the Super Duty was a 455 cubic inch engine, and although it looked like the regular 455 from the outside, nearly everything about this engine is different. The block casting is special, the cylinder head casting is special, even the distributor is unique to a Super Duty because the hole in the block is bigger than a regular Pontiac distributor. It's hard to tell from this shot, but there's a sticker on the driver's side valve cover of that Super Duty 455 engine, and it has some interesting notes on the sticker. It's unlike most any other sticker you see on a production engine. It actually talks about the oil usage. They recommend SAE 30 weight or 10W40. And then there's a note below that that actually talks about the proper way to replace and tighten the connecting rod nuts if this engine was ever disassembled. And normally, the manufacturer will say, torque the rod nuts to a certain torque specification, but this one actually provides a specification of bolt stretch. You're actually supposed to measure the length that the connecting rod bolts had stretched as you tighten the nuts. Although this is common practice in many race engines, you would never see this on a production engine, especially one made in 1974, giving you some more insight that this really is a race-bred engine. The Super Duty engine block had thicker webbing between the lifter bores and around the main bearing bulkheads to make the inside of the engine a lot stronger, making it a better choice for high RPM or drag racing use. It had 4-bolt main caps, and the rod bolts were interesting because they were upsized from 3/8 to 7/16 of an inch, connected to forged pistons, and it gave it a compression ratio of only 8.4 to 1, but that didn't mean it didn't make a lot of power. That 8.4 to 1 compression ratio was to meet some of the new 1974 emissions standards. But this thing had a great set of cylinder heads that were unique, with oversized intake and exhaust valves. It had a special long-duration high-lift camshaft, and it was fed by an 800 CFM Rochester Quadrajet 4-barrel carburetor and a special cast-iron intake manifold that was unique to the Super Duty engine. And even though it didn't have a high compression ratio, you know, this thing was rated at 290 horsepower and 390 foot-pounds of torque. But you have to remember that by 1971, those horsepower and torque numbers were rated differently. It used to be gross horsepower, which was the engine with no accessories, basically on a stand. And after 71, everything went to the net horsepower rating, which meant it had to power the belt-driven accessories and simulate being in the car. So the numbers dropped uniformly. But this thing still made a decent amount of power, and even with those Uniroyal tires, you could still knock down a mid-13-second quarter mile if you knew what you were doing. And speaking of the tires, we believe that these are the original tires that came on this car new that are still being worn today. Pontiac made a whole bunch of Trans Ams in 1974, but less than 1,000 came with the Super Duty engine, and out of those, only 212 had the 4-speed like this car. There weren't many of these cars produced, but most of the Super Duty Trans Ams for 1974 used a Turbo 400 automatic transmission. But believe it or not, the 4-speed manual was the standard trans. It's just more people opted to get the optional Turbo 400. Now, the Trans Am has always been about comfort, style, and performance, and the interior of our 74 model still reflects all of those cool Trans Am properties. We've always liked the Trans Am dashboards that have the engine-turned aluminum panel behind the gauges, and the gauges themselves are pretty unique. They're a very large gauge, very easy to read. The left-hand side has an 8,000 RPM tachometer, and the right side has a 160 mile-an-hour speedometer. In that 8,000 RPM tach, you'll also find a clock, and there's another interesting little badge on this dashboard. It says radial tune suspension, and that means this suspension system had an alignment setup designed to optimize radial tires, because back in the early 70s, radial tires on cars like this was still kind of a new thing. For other creature comforts, this one has an AM/FM radio, but no air conditioning because that was an automatic option only. But this one does have the 4-speed, and that is something that I would trade for the air conditioning any day of the week. 1974 was kind of a transition year in Firebird styling. Up front, it's the first year of the new federally mandated 5-mile-per-hour crash bumper, which detractors call the government bumper. And it's identifiable by a different style headlight. These are more like a scoop than the bull-nosed, rounded headlights of the past. And in back, gone is the chrome rear bumper, replaced with a 5-mile-an-hour crash bumper of its own. And 74 is also the last year of the smaller rear window. By 1974, the exterior styling had evolved. This body style debuted in 1970. Some people think that these earlier cars are the best looking ones of the second generation Firebird. It certainly is a good looking car, and it's a great color, and we really like the way the accent stripes and the Trans Am lettering and the SD 455 all contrast nicely against that vivid red. A few other styling elements that are easily recognizable as being Trans Am parts are the lowered air dam in the front, fender flare extensions in front of the front and rear wheels, the Pontiac Rally 2 wheels, and the rear spoiler across the back. Now, you could get these elements individually on a Firebird if you wanted to, but when you put that package together, it's obvious that this is a Trans Am. It's kind of a bummer that the Super Duty 455 had to go away, but that's why we're here. We're trying to keep these stories alive and share them with people that really dig them. You can see a lot more on our website at MuscleCarOfTheWeek.com and our Facebook page. And if you go to the YouTube channel, subscribe to never miss an episode of Muscle Car of the Week.